I gather that you were having some kind of an experience with the internet that was causing you anxiety, and that was somewhat of a starting point
Yeah.
for this project. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a long experience. It was just like, I guess I was 23, 24 around that time when I started writing the script. And yeah, it was kind of two things. It was performing that was giving me anxiety on stage. And then in my show, I started articulating that and found that a lot of people related to it, I think because of their relationship on the internet. They felt like they were performing on the internet in the same way I was performing on stage. So it made me, seeing their reaction made me reevaluate my relationship with the internet and realize that, I think a lot of this anxiety is actually coming from my participation on the internet just as a regular person, not as necessarily a professional performer.
Yeah.
So that was part of it. And then also just wanting to talk about the internet in a way that I felt like it hadn't been talked about, which is just this sort of granular, emotional stuff. Like what does it just feel like day to day to live with the internet, not let's talk about the internet as this big scary thing. Let's talk about like what it means to live our life with this thing in the background. So that was part of that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the film also serves an underrepresented audience, I guess for all ages really, like to tell the stories of people at that age.
Yeah.
There's not that many films really. There's famous ones from the past, but not a lot of contemporary ones.
Yeah, Stand By Me. I'm sort of thinking of 13-year-old.
400 Blows.
Yeah, 400 Blows. Yeah, of course.
What sort of, to what degree were you seeking to do that at the outset? And once you were, what kind of responsibility did you feel to representing that?
Yeah, I had felt for a while that I wanted to tell a middle school movie that I just felt like culturally the questions that used to be asked of 16, 17, 18-year-olds were now being asked of 12, 13, and 14-year-olds. I felt like by the time kids got to high school, they were sort of like blasé and jaded and over it. You know what I mean? They'd already kind of went through the trial by fire in that early stage. So I felt for a while like I think that a drama of American school actually happens much more in 8th grade than it does junior year of high in the sort of 80s, John Hughes era.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very conscious, and then the responsibility was just was very large. I mean, I felt when you have 13-year-olds in your hands as a filmmaker, you are very aware of the fact that they are the number one responsibility was like filming a pool party, making sure they don't drown. I mean, that was it was actually like a practical physical responsibility.
Yeah.
But the responsibility was just to communicate and to. They have much more self-awareness than I think people might think they do. They're aware that they're in a transitional period. They're aware that they're not their best version of themselves.
Right.
So they have even an ability to step outside of themselves and sort of laugh at their own experience. So I didn't have to feel like I was manipulating them or making fun of them.
Now, was there anything outside of performance, which obviously is huge, where Elsie kind of met the script and it evolved in some way?
Yeah, I mean, it was really just like the entire rehearsal process was just her doing it, and if anything sounded wrong, it was the script's fault. That was always the deferrals, that like if these words don't sound right, it must be the script's fault. If they're not gelling with her well. I mean, there's little things like Gucci that she came up with that, and there's little like decorative stuff in the room. Some of Kayla's interests, the drawings she's drawing in class are actually Elsie's drawings because she loves to draw. It was much more like it was a pretty good match. It felt pretty good. I felt like when she started working, I felt like I wrote it for her, even though I hadn't. So it was weird how little had to be changed.
One of the neat tricks for me of the film is that these advice videos, which start the film and run through the film, they begin charmingly, realistically inarticulate, and they end that way to some extent, but there is this definite evolution, right? That she's coming to more insights and she's getting more articulate as they move along.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how that aspect in the writing, was that intentional? Or does that just sort of come out in her performance?
Yeah, I think it's probably it wasn't necessarily intentional to be more articulate, but I think it was definitely intentional for the what's the word, for the actual like meat or the subject of the videos to change and become a little more self-aware, a little bit more forgiving, a little less blind to her own circumstance. So I think just naturally as I was writing that, it became less, like the first video, being yourself, she's explaining being yourself, and she is not being herself, and she is completely lying about everything she's saying.
Yeah.
So of course it's going to be less articulate, it's going to double back on itself, and it's going to question itself at every moment. And then by the end, when she's talking about, what she's going to be going forward, and she seems to, at that point, have gained a little bit of forgiveness for herself, and she's not setting up impossible standards to live to. It was less doubled back. So yeah, yes, I think you're totally right. It's a great point that she gains more and more control, I think, over her own image, or maybe she lets go of her image more and more, and thus it gains a little bit of freedom in thought. But yeah, totally.
I wanted to also ask about, this is related to what you were just saying, I think, and also it's inseparable from the internet, but the impact of celebrity culture on you as a celebrity, but also on the non-celebrity. What are your feelings on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it used to be like celebrities were like Mount Olympus. They were just like this thing way away from us, and we were all down here. But like social media really just kind of like blew open the spectrum, where it starts with getting one like and it ends at Kim Kardashian. You know what I mean? Like we all exist on a continuum, and if you just get more likes, you'll get there. Like it's very weird to. It's the same thing with like scrolling through Twitter. You will see in no particular order your mother, you, your school, the president of the United States, Geico. You know what I mean? It's like. We're all existing in the same medium right next to each other, so I do think we perceive each other as, it's weird, like, we've been, like since the internet, we've been doing two things violently, like trying to humanize celebrities, which is ridiculous because it never really happens actually, and trying to celebritize the regular people. And now we're all existing in this murky sort of middle ground that I don't think is good. But yeah, I think that's the problem, is that like, I feel celebrity culture. I feel the sort of stresses of fame and perception and performance happening at ground zero, which would be regular 8th graders in middle school, treating each other as if it's Hollywood, as if it's it's really strange.
Sincerity is not new in your work, but there is somewhat of a tonal shift here, I think, to what you're doing here. Did you have to relearn how to express yourself to write? This is not your first script, of course. You have another one that just got a deal, I think, to go into production, right? Gay Kid and Fat Chick. So maybe you could talk about your evolution as a writer of narrative films, as opposed to writing a stand-up act.
Yeah, I mean, to me, truly, it always felt like I was desperate to. It was harder for me to. In the last few years doing stand-up, it was harder for me to sort of get myself to be cynical and ironic and sharp and everything. I wanted just to be genuine. I wanted to just be like realer and more emotional. So writing the script was actually very freeing. It was at a time where I was like so done with stand-up, and I was like, I just want to write something I enjoy writing. So, and it actually came much more natural. I mean, but yeah, I've been writing scripts since I was about 18 and. Just in my free time, and yeah, the process has been very interesting and sort of. It really just got to the point of at first when I was 18, trying to write some sort of poppy pyrotechnic movie, and then at a certain point realizing that sort of what I like is writing when it feels like you're just listening and you're giving people time to express themselves, and you're not planning things out. You're not going into a scene knowing how it's going to end. You're just going into a situation and then having someone speak and having someone respond, and then what would they say? What would they say? And then just seeing where it goes. But yeah, the truth is, it comes way more naturally to me than my stand-up, in terms of like my natural disposition, I think, is to be more just hard on my sleeve. I would have to toughen up on the other side.
On a similar note, you started out as a teenage YouTuber, right? And now you're a film director. So what's the educational trajectory? What's your film education that got you here? Which I assume was homegrown.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I made a television show when I was 21 on MTV, and I created that and starred in it. So I got to be on set a lot and watch people work, and I've been in a few movies where I got to see, and that's the best education is to, just be on set and see people work. Watching a lot of movies, writing scripts, just being a fan of things, and then 8 months before we shot this movie, it was greenlit, so I had that time to just read a book a week and just try to crash myself through film school. Also making my specials and directing a few other people's specials was very informative, and I tried to sort of bring the sort of film language and grammar to the stand-up specials, so it felt like, even though I didn't make a short film, I felt like I had made a short film within those in certain ways. But yeah, that was, it's been sort of cobbled together, and I'm just trying to, scramble to make up for my lack of film school.
I do want to ask a couple things about your stand-up. One thing that's a hallmark of your stand-up is a tendency to sort of draw attention to the artifice of it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that kind of Penn and Teller tension between the fakery and the honesty, if that comes out of an obsession with the craft, that you just kind of, it's so in your head, like what you're doing as you're writing it, or where does that come from?
I think that's probably true. That might definitely be true. It was also just I did a very theatrical sort of show, and the whole thing about being on stage and comedy is, you should be honest, you should be honest, you should be honest. And for me, it was my form of honesty, that the way for me to be honest was to be
this is absurd.
This is ridiculous. Yeah, exactly. I can't really get to the point where I'm talking honestly about myself until we address the elephant in the room, which is that I'm standing on a stage and you're all staring at me, and this is really weird, and I'm pretending like I'm doing this for the first time, and I've done it 80 times.
Right.
So that's what it sort of was. It was sort of trying to do a sort of meta honesty, a sort of deeper honesty, which is if we're going to be really honest, let's be honest about how weird it is that this is part of our culture, that you sit here and watch me, and so that was part of it, because I just found the comedians that were super celebrities getting on stage talking about their kids or their, just well, you're not really being honest about a big thing, which is that you're not an everyman. You're you used to be an everyman, then you got famous, and now you're not everyman.
Right.
So that was sort of, or every woman.
The other thing that comes through for me in the kind of character that you're playing there, that more arrogant version of yourself, I guess, or that kind of guy, is the frustration over the way the game is played, and and hating the game, and it's partly, there's a sense to me about well, maybe I'm just thinking about it because I was going to interview you, but about career too, that there's this game you have to play. You could sort of hack it a little bit, but it's kind of what it is, including things like this, right? Mm-hmm. And then life itself, you can game to a certain extent, but like you say, we're all dying. Nobody gets out alive. So can you talk about that element of expressing frustration or venting?
I think that's a great point. I think that's a totally great point you make, and that was the hope in the show, that I can express the frustration of the confines I'm specifically in as a comedian, but everyone has their confines and everyone is frustrated by them.
Right.
It was also do kind of a weird little angry Bugs Bunny up there. I just kind of that was just sort of the funny character I decided on, just some arrogant guy that's also out of control of his show and is sort of doesn't know what to do. But what was the last part of that? Can you explain what?
Just about venting frustration.
It felt. I don't know. I mean, I felt at the time, and still do to a certain degree, that just man, this culture is insane, and pop culture is insane, and I always felt so gross for participating in it, you know what I mean? So so hypocritical for participating in it. So what I'll just be an angry hypocrite, because that's a coherent, at least, worldview. Is that if you know what I mean, that because that kind of made sense to me. But yeah, it's I don't know. There's a lot to be frustrated by in the world of entertainment and culture and comedy. It's all just sort of gross and weird, and So and everyone is so happy. I mean, everyone's smiling, and it's not much to smile about, and then then the cult and then that sort of thing, that exact thing I felt just sort of absolutely jumped the shark, and with the election and everything, and Trump was roasted on Comedy Central and like learned all of the tools that he used in the primaries at his Comedy Central roast. Like I really do think like comedy is at fault in a big way. Yeah.
Speaking of gross and weird in the culture, going back to 8th grade, one of the scenes that's drawing the most attention is there's a scene in the backseat of a car between Elsie's character and one that's a few years older than her. Can you talk about where that scene came from and what it means to you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of the scenes just come from, again, trying to just like listening to what the story is doing and not trying to project too much stuff and not trying to plan too much. But yeah, I mean, as it's happening and I realize what the kind of scene that's happening is happening, I'm very aware of it and trying to treat it sensibly. I mean, what it means to me is, you know, just trying to portray, or at least in part, what it means to me is trying to portray a type of scene that, when described after the fact, doesn't sound like a big deal. You can imagine her 6 months later telling the story and someone going, so what, you like touched your arm and went in the back seat and you said no and you stopped? What's the big deal? You know, but when you sit in that moment with her in real time, the subjective truth of it, which is the actual truth, I think, is that it is incredibly violating and emotionally violent, and it doesn't have to be literally criminal to be incredibly wrong, you know, and then that's kind of ended up coinciding with what's happening in the culture, which is great. And also to hopefully open up a conversation about like what we're teaching kids in terms of, you know, we teach them how to put on condoms, we don't teach them like how to be a boyfriend, how to be a girlfriend, how to actually enter your first sexual encounter and what you are owed and what should be said and what needs to be said or it's criminal. So that's what's important to me, is to sort of explore. It doesn't go a certain it doesn't go where people think it's going to go or where people are scared it's going to go. But just because it doesn't go there doesn't mean it isn't really, really wrong and really traumatic. So that was sort of the part of it.
Well, I'm out of time, but I want to ask one exit question, which is, in the film, there's a scene about superlatives being handed out to the kids. Were you given a superlative at that age?
I won Best Actor for being in Footloose in 8th grade. But we had a most shy. And I remember even like the next year looking back and being like, that's really mean. Like, I don't think he and she identified as shy. Like, no, I don't think any kid identifies as shy. Yeah. But we still had. We had most shy. We had best eyes, which is just crazy. Best smile.
And what superlative would you give yourself now?
As a 27-year-old? That's a great question. Unfortunately, the obvious would be most tall. But yeah, it would just be most tall.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great questions, man. I appreciate it. Those were all really nice.
Thank you.
All stuff a lot of it not been asked before. It's really cool.
Great. Thanks.
Appreciate your time.